get on board. All right, so we're looking at, oh, Dylan, by the way, I haven't graded your papers yet, so uh, I'll get to them today, hopefully. So this chapter in Migliore is dealing with creation, and so we've looked at the nature of God, and obviously, sort of one of the things that Migliore is doing, and what you do sort of in systematic theology, is you go from, you build sort of your progression of your theological argument. So you look at the nature of God, the next thing is creation, because, that's God's the origin and source of creation. So once you've sort of defined the nature of God, then you move to that element. So that's part of the reason why this is the next step, but also it just follows sort of how human history would follow too. You have this sort of conversation about God's nature and so forth, and then out of that you come up with, you begin to explore sort of how we came into existence and how all of the universe and so forth came into existence. So the first the first question that I pose to you all is, what's the 5 sort of deep-seated attitudes and practices that underlie is sort of the ecological crisis? Now, one of the things that's important here that Migliore is trying to present is that one of the issues with society today, and the reason why we're facing an ecological crisis, and this isn't really whether you believe sort of in sort of human sort of influence of the rise in temperatures and those kind of things. I mean, he's certainly, that's some of the argument he's making, but he's making more a philosophical, theological statement and sort of unpacking it than he is talking purely about some sort of, some people believe this, some people believe that. So, try to separate that, so that this isn't really a question of whether you believe humans are influenced climate change or not. This is really some basic assumptions and the way we behave and interact. And so that's different than that other kind of question. So what are the 5 deep-seated attitudes and practices that he says underlie the ecological crisis? And also the reason why he's starting with this is that this points to how people understand human relationship to creation, well, meaning the environment, but also the purpose of creation from God's perspective. So that's part of the reason why he's asking this question. So what does Migliore say are the 5 deep-seated attitudes and practices?
The first one, I'm going to butcher the word, but anthropocentrism, is that how you say it?
Yeah, so this comes from the notion of the Anthropocene, but yes, anthropocentrism. And anthropocentrism is basically, and Dylan, if you remember, we talked about this in environmental ethics. The Anthropocene is sort of one way people discuss and describe the epoch we're in now, and basically that focuses on the fact that human beings are the sort of, we've made ourselves the primary worldview, and so our desires, our needs, so forth, come first. And so when you anthropomorphize something, you're making it in the image of a human being. And so when we talked about the nature of God, for example, and we talked about anthropomorphizing God, that's when we give attributes of humans to God. In this case, it's not giving attributes to nature that are human, but rather making our needs the center of everything. And so they outweigh any other needs. That's the first sort of thing that he's talking about. And what can lead from that, as he points out, is nature can have little or no value. And so, Dylan, if you remember from environmental ethics, this leads into sort of a utilitarian sort of use, that nature is there for human beings to use, and that it only has value in us using. That's part of what he's talking about. So what's the second attitude?
Power is domination.
Right. And what's he meaning by that, Carly? At least in your interpretation of what he's saying there?
From what I got from it was like embracing modern science and technology, because in the end it's going to help us. I don't know if that's like what he's saying, but that's what I got. But like, because it says it would be foolish and unhelpful not to like, maybe I'm reading it wrong, hang on.
No, so here you go. The goal of science has too often been seen as a subjugation of nature to human will, rather than the collaborating with nature for the common welfare of humankind. So what he's talking about here is that you can't reject science. You need to have collaboration. And he deals, at the end of this chapter, he talks more about modern science and theology or ecology or sort of creation view working together. But here, what he's talking about is we've used technology to dominate creation. And so again, if you think of like coal mining, for example, and the way that we engage in coal mining today, like these strip mines or the mountain tops where they blow off the top of a mountain to mine for coal. So in the old days, what did you do to mine for coal? You dug a hole in the ground, right? And you kept going deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper into the ground. Now, obviously that had risks for the miners and so forth. And there's only so many holes and tunnels you can dig underground, and there's only so far you can go, and it becomes very expensive, all of those things. But from a perspective of the sort of how it marked nature, if you will, like when you go to a region where there are lots of coal mines, really all you see is, usually boarded up like entryways or whatever, or closed off entryways so people can't wander down into these. Or sometimes you might go to a place where there's coal mines today where they're partially open so you can walk through part of them or whatever. But basically, it's a hole in the ground, right? That's what a traditional coal mine is. Today, mining companies do things called strip mining, and they blow up the tops of these mountains to get at the coal and these kind of things. Well, what happens there is this is more efficient in this sort of technological sense. It's more cost effective, and it doesn't risk as many human lives as it does to send someone down in a mine shaft. The problem is, if you go to a place that strip mining has been employed, or you go to a place where these mountaintops have been blown off in West Virginia and these other places where they do this practice now, you see terrible environmental degradation. I mean, all the trees around and the vegetation is often destroyed. The water can be heavily polluted. Now, I'm not suggesting that these things didn't happen when you did traditional mining of digging up holes in the ground, but they were less impactful on the environment around. And so that's what he's talking about here. So Carly, you're right in the one sense that Migliore is pointing out the fact that we shouldn't ignore technology and science. and we need to have a responsible relationship between it and theology, if you will. But power as domination here is really more about the way we use technology to control nature and to dominate it, if you will. Does that make sense to you all?
Yes.
Okay. Dylan, does that make sense?
Sir.
All right. What's number 3 here?
Denial of interconnectedness, which is talking about how everything created is connected, and that we lack a value or respect for the other creatures that are created.
Right. And so here, Migliore wants us to understand that we have existed now for mostly in the modern era. I'll frame it that way because the sort of pre-modern era and going back to earlier times, human beings saw much more interconnectedness before, with all of life. And if any of you have ever studied, if you took religions of the world, or you've looked at like Native American spirituality or Aboriginal spirituality from, places like New Zealand and Australia and those kind of places, one of the things you'll notice is that their spirituality isn't interconnected. So they see the relationship, like when the Native Americans, before they go hunt buffalo, they have a prayer ritual and they have a sort of process where they sort of imagine themselves connected to that buffalo. And then when they actually kill the buffalo, they have a service, a prayer and remembrance and reflection. And so even though they kill the buffalo out of necessity because they need the fur, the skins and the fur and the meat and all of those kind of things, they recognize that they're doing harm to the natural world. And so they thank their, gods for it. And they even thank the buffalo for giving up its life and this kind of thing. And Western society and even Western Christianity or Northern Christianity, as opposed to some Southern sort of expressions of Christianity, have lost that sense of interconnectedness. And so, I'm sure the two of you, like myself, we don't usually go to a farm, for example, and pick out the pig to be slaughtered or the cow to be slaughtered or whatever. We just go to the grocery store and buy these things already packaged, and we have no connection to where that food source comes from. And I'm just using animals, for example, but the same thing is true for plants. Most of us aren't going into our garden and picking the tomatoes and onions and so forth that we're eating, or the lettuce. We're just going to the grocery store and getting it. And so the more that we become distanced from the sources of these things, the less interconnectedness we experience. And the same is true for the other parts of the environment, even though, like in Habersham County, for example, it's a more rural county than, Fulton County or DeKalb or these other, counties in Georgia. And so we have more trees and natural environment around us, but most of us still live in houses that have heat systems and air conditioning systems and all of that. And so we don't experience interconnectedness in the same way as our ancestors did. And so that's what he's driving at. All right, what's the fourth assumption or the fourth sort of attitude?
Assumption of limitless resources.
Yeah, and obviously that really is coming up with the notion that, and you'll listen to people talk about, oh, well, gasoline, oil is never going to run out, or if it does run out, it's going to be in 500 years, or, or coal is going to, or any of these things, trees, for example, and our ancient and our ancestors, before us, the reason why there aren't many buffalo roaming wild, for example, is not because the Native Americans went and killed off millions of buffalo. It's when our ancestors came from Europe here and they brought guns, and guns were much more efficient at killing buffalo, for example, than a bow and arrow was or a spear was. It wasn't that the Native Americans couldn't kill animals this way, but a gun is more efficient at doing it. And so our ancestors killed more of these in event, or, and so the population couldn't keep up. So basically the balance gets thrown out. Another example is fishing, for example, like industrial scale fishing for tuna or salmon or these kind of things. In earlier times, our ancestors believed these things would never disappear. And then when you had big fishing trawlers that just, put nets into the water and, dragged through the water and caught thousands of tuna at one time, not only did they catch tuna, but they also scooped up all kinds of other sea life with it. But the tuna can't repopulate or reproduce at that level. And so all of a sudden, what seemed to be a limitless resource becomes endangered, and sometimes to the point where it's almost extinct. And so that's the sort of notion and attitude that we have here about that. And that's what Migliore, wants us to understand. And then the last one he talks about is unchecked consumerism. And obviously, this is a commentary really particularly on North American society, but also sort of Western Europe to some degree. But, our economy is driven by us buying stuff. In the old days, our economy was driven by us making stuff, right? And now our economy is driven by us buying stuff. And so, every time we need to buy things, every time we need to, and everything we make is not recyclable, or, just like our phones. When cell phones first came out, you could replace the battery, right? I mean, they came with batteries that you could either separate from the phone or take out from the back, or whatever. And now the phones that most of us own are hermetically sealed, if you will. And so the battery, when it goes, the phone's dead, and so that forces you to buy a new phone, even if you don't really need a new phone. Or, they make the software so it's not compatible with an older version. And so the sort of obsolescence that's built into our technology and other things that we purchase, not just technology, but it's a good example, it leads to unchecked consumerism. And so we need to have continually buy stuff, not just to have things for our own necessity, like clothes or whatever, but we just need to continually buy stuff because that's the only thing that fuels economic growth in our society. So those are the 5 things that Migliore is, and then he's gonna, the rest of this chapter is trying to lay out a theology on how to address those. That's what he's doing. So, all right. So he makes this statement, or I asked this question: what does the theological statement dominion of care rather than dominion of abuse mean? And what do you all think? What does that theological statement, dominion of care rather than dominion of abuse, mean?
I mean, I could be completely wrong because I don't think I'm understanding it. What I thought he was trying to say was, it says dominion over earth. This must be understood in the context of the distinction or distinctive identification of God. So, the distinction, domination of care would be, caring for the earth and like having the respect of the other inhabitants of earth as well, instead of like using the natural resources to max capacity and like, if you, do you get what I'm trying to say? I don't think I know what I'm trying to say, but
Oh, you're on the right track, Dylan. Can you help her out here? Dylan?
Yeah, I'm here. I've got nothing.
All right. So, Carly, you're on the right track. And so, in the creation story at the beginning of the Bible in Genesis, one of the things that when God created, so for those of you that took Old Testament Hebrew Bible, you'll know there's two creation stories. There's the one that starts in chapter 1, verse 1, and goes to chapter 2 verse 4. That's the sort of first creation story. And then we have a second mirroring story that starts in chapter 2, verse 5, basically, and goes on through there. And in the first creation story, all God created, out of the sort of waters that were teeming or whatever, the chaos. God created formed the earth, and then there was light and there was darkness and all this kind of stuff. And the story goes through each phase of creation, and it goes through, and then there were plants, and then there were animals, and at the end of each thing, and God said it was good. And this is important. If you didn't catch it, the reference, the title of this chapter is The Good Creation. And the reason Migliore chooses that is because after each thing that God creates, before the next day starts, it said, and it was good. So the notion is that creation is good, and that each of the things that God created are good themselves. So anyway, but when in that story, humans are created together at the same time, and they're given dominion over creation. In the other story, uh, Adam is created, and then that's the story where we talk about Adam being put to sleep and Eve being created out of Adam's rib and that kind of stuff. Uh, the funny thing is that if you haven't taken Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, most people that learn these stories in Sunday school or other places think they're just one story, and they sort of mix the two together, and they don't realize that they're two stories that come from slightly different time periods describing the same event, the creation event. Anyway, in that first story where it says, and God gave dominion over creation to humans, part of it, what was imagined by some humans, and how some human history has come forward out of that, was that it meant that human beings had the right to use creation any way they wanted to. So this is part of, back to that notion of anthropocentrism, that it's part of that, and it's part of that power as dominion. It works both of these into. And so in that theory of dominion, it meant that we human beings sat at the top of the food chain, if you will, and the top of the creation chain on earth. And so if we needed trees for something, we just cut them down and didn't think about replanting new ones or using them sparingly. If we needed land to till to grow vegetables or whatever, we just tilled as much land and used as much water and all of that. And so that notion is what Migliore is framing, the sort of dominion of abuse, meaning that everything is centered around human beings using creation and the natural resources for their own betterment, and without any regard for the fact that God created these things, all of them, as good and for our use. And so dominion of care is the notion that, yes, we have dominion over it, but it's the notion of like responsibility. So the difference there is that in that model, you still have the right, if you will, to use trees or use animals or whatever to sustain our life. But you have to do it in a responsible way. So you can't just go and cut all the trees down without planting new trees, or you can't go and just dig up all the land and plant crops without thinking about how much water that requires to use and that kind of stuff. So that's the difference between dominion of care and dominion of abuse, if you will. And if you look at a theological position, you see churches that sort of model these kind of things. Some churches will talk about creation care, if you will, or are more concerned about the environment and climate change and these kind of things. And those churches would be in Migliore's sort of framing here, ones that are sort of in that dominion of care model. Then you have churches that sort of talk about the fact that humans, that all of this was created for us to use, and that, we don't have to worry about the environment per se, because that's going to be that's God's responsibility to worry about the environment. And from Migliore's framing, that would be sort of the dominion of abuse, meaning that you just look at the environment and all of nature as your right to use as you see fit. And theologies develop around that. And so that's what and that's why it's an important distinction, because once you, depending on which theological position you take, obviously, then it models these different behaviors in the world as well. All right. So he gives 5 themes pertaining to the doctrine of creation. And what are those 5 themes?
The first one, it says to speak of the world as God's creation is first of all to make affirmation about God. And I found a spot in the book that I wanted to quote. Hang on, I gotta find it again. Well, I can't find it, but I think it was basically saying like God is created everything, so we have to acknowledge the fact that everything is created because of him. Like we're not just entitled to it. He created it for a reason.
Right, right. And so, and think this plays back to this sort of notion here plays back to our discussion with Sally McFay and looking at models of God, right? And one model of God is talking about God as creator. And so that if you start with that premise that God created it, there's also the sort of, there's the notion that the radical otherness, we're all the creatures. And so the trees are the creatures, the beavers are the creatures and so forth. And so all of us, and God transcends all of that, right? So one of the things that we need to recognize first and foremost is in that sort of fact that God created it all belongs to God as well, right? I mean, we belong to God and all the animals and trees and so forth and the earth. And so if we're going to honor God, one of the things that Migliore is driving at is one of the ways you honor God is by respecting the fact that we're all creatures. And it's not an us against them sort of mindset. And that's part of what has happened in some theological camps. We've seen nature, if you will, like the outdoors, as opposing human beings, and that we need to subdue it. And so that's the first thing, is that, we're all part of God's thing. The next one, and this one's a little more tricky. So it's on page 105, and he says that the doctrine of creation is also at once an affirmation about God and an affirmation about the world and ourselves. So the second theme of this doctrine is that the world as a whole and all beings individually are radically dependent on God. And so that's not just the interconnectedness that we were talking about a minute ago. That's also recognizing that everything that exists, it has some dependence on God. And so obviously, um, again, that's why he starts with God the creator. If God created this all, you also are all radically dependent upon God for your existence and your sustenance. So it's the notion um, that we can't separate ourselves and position ourselves above the rest of creation as somehow implying that we have less dependence on God than the trees do, for example. Now, the trees have a different responsibility in this kind of relationship, right? I mean, trees don't have a mind. They take in carbon dioxide, they pump out oxygen, they use water to and sunlight to nourish themselves, but they don't have the same responsibility in the creation that you and I do per se. Uh, and so this isn't to say that we're equal in the sense that we have equal responsibility, but it is to say that we all have a radical dependence on God. And so we're not different from a tree or a fish in that sense. And if we lose sight of that, then we begin to uh, lose sight of the fact that, we're in this together, if you will. All right. What's the third one?
In all that is contingency, finitude, and limitation, creation is good.
Okay, so what's he trying to say there?
Because God is good, everything that he's created is good because we were created in his image.
Okay, um, and obviously he has a bunch of contingent, like a point A, a point B, and
Mhm.
a point C and D and so forth. But the basic line is this is getting back to what I was saying about the story. When each time God creates, it was good. And in the argument here that's being made, which is really important, is this is sort of, if you remember in New Testament, we talked about Gnosticism, and that was an early movement in the Christian church that eventually sort of separated itself, although some people still sort of stayed in the church itself, but the majority of Gnostics sort of broke off and formed their own sort of religious expression. But one of the things that Gnosticism implied and said was that matter was evil, and that it was this divine spark or spirit that was in human beings in particular, because, um, and we had to uncover that, and that divine spark is what was good in us. And so this notion that this third uh, statement that Migliore is putting out here is a direct counter to that, in that all of matter, all of creation is good because it's in the image of God and it was created by God. So it's not that there's matter is evil, which is basically how Gnosticism framed it. And so the world is evil, and the human body is evil, except for this divine spark which resides in it. And through secret knowledge or some attainment of knowledge, you enliven that spark, and then it leaves your body and reconnects to God. That's the sort of theological quick sketch of Gnosticism. And this is a direct counter to that, because that sort of theory, if matter is evil, then again you're right to destroy it, right? So if you think of the world around us as being dangerous or evil, what would you do to things that are evil? You try to destroy them, right? And so that's why he's making this case here, that we have to focus on the fact that it all comes from God and it's all good because it's created in the image of God, and there isn't. And that's why he makes that little caveat that while we're imperfect, we're still good. And so that's also a counter to the notion of perfectionism that exists in some expressions of Christianity, is that the only good part of creation is this sort of effort to be perfect. And that when imperfect is present, it's not good anymore. And Migliore is trying to counter that as well. All right. The fourth one says, and this is on page 108, says, um, is the coexistence and interdependence of all created beings. And he goes on to say, our creaturehood means radical coexistence, mutual independence, rather than solitary or monarchic existence. And so what he's driving at there is, and he goes on further, the creation of human beings with each other and with other creatures is an unmistakable theme of the Genesis creation story. For all their differences, both narratives of, and this is where he's talking about the two different creation stories, both narratives of creation in Genesis portray human beings as standing in organic relation to each other and the world of nature. And so this isn't just about the sort of notion of we're independent or interconnected. This is the notion that we're organically, linked to all of creation. And so, if you think about what's happening in the environment right now, or what's happened in the past, when we abuse certain parts of the environment, going back to the ocean, for example, we know that the temperature is rising in the sea. And even people that don't believe in sort of human interaction causing that will admit that, because it's obvious. You stick a thermometer in the water and the temperature is, 87, and last year the temperature was 84. You can't really argue with that fact. And so no one's going to argue with the fact that the water temperature in the ocean is rising. What the cause of it is where people argue, per se. But what Migliore's making the point here is that when the water temperature rises, and it consistently rises, what happens? Coral starts to die, for example. And if coral dies, then the fish and the other sea life that congregate around coral for nutrients and other things begin to become less, because they don't have a place to congregate and to nest and all the other things. And so as the coral dies, the sea life that's living around it becomes less. And then those smaller fish and smaller animals and sea life and so forth, as they become less, the bigger fish that feed upon them and the bigger animals, the whales and so forth that eat plankton, don't have as much food to eat. And so they begin to starve. And so what do? As they begin to starve, they move further out into the water in search of food. Uh, and so the first signs are that, certain types of whales appear in regions they've never been in before. And that's because they're out looking for food. And or sharks, for example, appear in regions that they've never been in before. And they can't find food or adequate food, so they get more hungry, and then they begin to die out, and this kind of thing. Or tuna, for example, which are hunting fish like sharks. And each level, as it goes up, that eventually then affects us, because the warming of the water gives us less food out of the ocean, for example. And all that sea life that was in there is less able, the absence of it doesn't do as good of a job cleaning the ocean, for example. or replenishing nutrients in the ocean. And then, the obvious expression for us of the warming of the sea life, I mean, all of us have realized that this has been the most disastrous hurricane season on record. And that's a direct result of the heating of the ocean. You know, hurricanes are dependent on warmer water for their energy. And as water gets warmer, and as it gets warmer in wider areas, that means there's more energy for hurricanes. And so you'll get more hurricanes, and then they become more destructive, and all these kind of things. And so one of the things that this fourth point is trying to make is that that's the sort of organic link. We can't separate these things and say, gee, well, just because this ocean water is getting warmer, and well, yeah, that affects fish some level and coral and these kind of things. I don't really need to worry about that too much because it hasn't affected my life, because I don't eat tuna, for example, or I don't go scuba diving and see the coral. And most people in the world don't do those things, right? So, but when hurricanes get worse, and the Gulf Coast now, Louisiana had 4 hurricanes that hit them this year. Um, that's a different reality then. And so that's what he's talking about here with the organic sort of nature of it, is that it's more than just interconnected. It really is part of this sort of infleshment, if you will, that we can't separate them. All right, and then the last one is God the Creator, and this is on 109. God the Creator is purposive, and the world that God has created is dynamic and purposeful. So what he's saying there is basically God creates the purpose. So God set in motion the arc so God created, God set in motion the creation story. And every now and again, God intercedes. It's not like God's a watchmaker that just built this big, watch that spins, or the pieces move around and keep time and go forward, kind of thing. God's actively involved, but God has created a purpose, and not just a purpose for each of us, but a purpose for all of creation. And God's the organizing agent of that purpose. And it's creation's responsibility to carry that purpose out. So the argument here isn't just that you and I as human beings have a purpose. The plants have a purpose, the fish in the sea, the deer, and everything has a purpose. And God organizes and originates that purpose, and then creation fulfills it. And so one of the points that would be is when we disrupt creation, we're disrupting the purpose, for example. And so that would be the counter, the problem with it is, if the deer, for example, have a purpose, I personally, I don't know what the deer's purpose is per se, but whatever their purpose is, that purpose, if we encroach upon their habitat, for example, or we overhunt them, for example, or they get some kind of disease because of interaction with human beings that is detrimental to the deer, then their purpose gets disrupted. And we don't know necessarily what the effects of that disruption are. A good example, and maybe some of you saw this, this is why GMOs, for example, are questionable, these genetically modified organisms. This is part of the reason why people have a problem with GMOs. I mean, they don't always frame it in a theological perspective, but part of the reason they sometimes have a problem is because the genetic modification of an organism may disrupt its purpose, okay? And a good example, good, bad, or indifferent, in Florida, they're going to release, I don't know, like a million genetically modified mosquitoes. And these mosquitoes are basically sterile, or they'll, when, yeah. And so they can't mate, or take that back. They're genetically modified. So when they do mate, they create sterile mosquitoes that are the result of the mating. Anyway, the point of these genetically modified mosquitoes is to reduce dengue fever and West Nile virus in particular, which are things that exist in the United States and other places of the world. These similar mosquitoes have been used to combat malaria. Now, most of us don't like mosquitoes, and frankly, we wouldn't care so much if a certain breed or genus of mosquitoes disappeared. But what animal lives on mosquitoes? Bats, for example, eat mosquitoes, right? And birds eat mosquitoes, but bats are one of the big things that eat mosquitoes. So if there are less mosquitoes for the bats to eat, then what effect does that have on the bat population? It will potentially reduce the bat population. And then the bat population gets reduced, and what feeds on the bats and so forth, or what do the bats do otherwise? Um, a few years ago, we talked about the collapse of bee colonies around the world. And we know that even though you and I personally might not like bees, or we could be allergic to bee sting or whatever, bees are essential to pollinating plants and flowers and crops and all of these kind of things. And so when bee colonies collapse, it has a negative impact on the growth of all kinds of different plants and crops as well that we rely upon. And scientists couldn't understand these collapse of bee colonies. And now we think we've discovered one of the things is certain insecticides that are used, or other chemicals that are used on crops and stuff may be harming the bees at a genetic level, and that's causing these bee colony collapses. And there's a perfect example of what Migliore is talking about in this last part. I mean, it gets to what he was just talking about the organic relationship, but also the purpose. The bees become less, and one of their purposes is to pollinate plants and crops and so forth, and the pollination doesn't happen, and then you and I have less food, for example. And so that's the sort of the argument there. All right. So Migliore makes why is the Trinitarian doctrine of creation a vital resource for an ecologically responsible doctrine of creation? I know that's a mouthful, but why is it important?
Do you want us to just like start with the reasons
Yeah.
that it gives? The first one is that the Trinitarian theology holds together the affirmations of the transcendence of God over the creation and the immanence of God in the creation.
Yeah, and so right, and that's again what we were talking about God as creator, right?
Yeah.
And so that's the first thing. What's the next thing it does?
The second way in which Trinitarian understanding of God provides a resource for ecological doctrine of creation is the possibility it offers of viewing the coherence and rich diversity of the created order as rooted in and consistent with the life of the true God.
All right. Do you have any idea what he's saying there?
I'm going to be completely honest. I didn't understand that one when I read it, and I read it like 4 times.
Yeah. So what he's saying here is that a Trinitarian theology of creation finds the source of unity and difference and their harmony in the triune creator. That's the basic summary of what he's saying there. So in the Trinity, we find unity in the Trinity, right? That's one of the primary realities of the Trinity, is that Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are unity. They're connected, and they're one being. They're three persons in one being, but they're different, right? God the Father, or God the Mother, or God the Creator has certain responsibilities. God the Son, God this, Redeemer, has other responsibilities. So these are sort of modes or functions. And then the Holy Spirit, again, has other things of sustaining. And so not only is there unity in the Trinity, there's difference. And so, but they're held together by this notion of relationship, that their relationship is essential. So if you break the relationship between, the Holy Spirit and the Father, for example, or the Mother, if you break that relationship, then not only do you not have the Trinity anymore, God, the first person of the Trinity, and the third person of the Trinity don't function properly anymore. And so we find that same model in creation. So even though we're different than birds, for example, we are held together by the unity that we're all created by the same source. That's the first thing. But our difference is obviously the expression of us being humans and the bird being a bird, and also our purpose is different and all those kind of things. So that's the difference. But we can't separate ourselves, because if we sort of try to decouple ourselves because we're different, then our uniqueness, our purpose begins to not function properly, if you will. And the birds is the same way. And so that's where the Trinity, that's what he's trying to say there, is the holding together in that way. And that if you attempt to decouple these because of their difference, the whole system falls apart. It doesn't function anymore. All right. So 113, it says the third way in which the Trinitarian doctrine provides an essential resource for an ecological doctrine of creation is that it underscores the goodness of creation, its groaning, and its longing to be renewed and perfected. And so there, what he's simply trying to make the point is that from a Trinitarian perspective, again, all things were created good. The groaning part of it is that creation struggles. Groaning happens when you're growing and when you're retracting, if you will, or you're dying. So groans are part of the natural life process, if you will. And so, although we don't really remember these things, sometimes people talk about them, that when they were young, you can feel almost your bones like sort of getting longer, and there's pain in that sometimes. That's a groaning process, but it's a growing one. And then at the end of your life, when you're sort of retracting, the same sort of thing takes place. And so, and then the other part that he puts in here, and this is down near the bottom, he says the only adequate horizon for understanding creation as dynamic, unfinished reality is the history of the triune God's relationship within it, a history that bears the sign of the cross as well as the promise of resurrection. And so from a Christian perspective, you have to frame this in the context of the cross and resurrection. And so the cross sort of, it breaks the cycle of sin, if you will, and the resurrection offers the new promise of, the promise of life. And so the cross and the sort of ecological reality breaks the sort of destruction or breaks the sort of behavior of destruction and disrupts it, if you will, and then in the process of death and creation and all of that, and then the promise of new life. So from Migliore's perspective, you can't just have, you have to have the cross as part of the essential sort of narrative from a Christian perspective. So that adds a different level to the frame of the Trinitarian sort of aspect. All right. I'm going to leave it there because it's 9. The only other part that he had was, so the last part where he models models of creation, and that's just like two pages, 114 and 115, and there's five models, and he really is picking up. He even references Sally McFay, and that's why I'm sort of you all can work out this on your own, because it's really going back to the conversation we had around Sally McFay's book. He actually picks up her sort of premise and even references her in that, and so he's really developing the same kind of methodology that McFay used around her metaphorical language for God. So any questions from either of you on this?
No, I don't have any.
Dylan, do you got any questions?
No, sir, I'm good.
All right. I will. Dylan, do you think you'll be back on Thursday?
Hopefully, but I'll let you know.
Okay. Well, I won't do a Zoom link until late Wednesday or something, and we'll assume that we're going to meet in class on Thursday morning, unless you all hear otherwise. Okay.
Okay.
All right. Take care, everyone, and I will see you all on Thursday.